endlessly searching for an original sin.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Sweet Pool. So are we demons? Vampires? Well, let's find out. He couldn't remember how he made it home that night. Before he knew it, he was back in his room, sitting on the floor with the lights off. Strangely enough, he felt rather calm, to the point he grew concerned that he'd lost his emotions entirely. He didn't want to think about anything, or go anywhere, or deal with anyone. Thankfully, it was the weekend, and he had no reason to leave the house. He didn't know whether it was night or day. He wandered in and out of faint dreams, sleeping a bit and then waking up before eventually falling asleep once more. The only thing that remained constant was the drone of the rain beating against his window. Hey, it's raining outside here. His body was feverish and lethargic. Perhaps he had caught a cold. He sat on the love seat with his knees up to his chest. His dull, vacant gaze drifted to the phone lying on the table. Come to think of it, he hadn't responded to Erica yet. Slowly, he reached out and grabbed his phone. The slightest movement made his body ache. He pressed the reply button and typed out a brief message. Sorry for the late reply. Congrats! Can't wait to see my new nephew. Emails were a convenient way to carry out a conversation without exposing one's true emotions. Yuji pressed the send button and set his phone back down on the table. Even when he was sitting perfectly still, his body continued to ache. Each pulse of pain brought a new wave of shame, driving the wounds in his spirit wider. He couldn't fix his body. He could fix his body, but not his heart. There was nothing left. Everything was just misery. He leaned his back against the love seat and closed his eyes. Clearing his mind, he focused on the rhythm and sound of his breathing. Little by little, his hearing grew sharper. He could hear the hum of the aquarium, the steady beat of the rain. The blood pulsed through his veins. Burying his face against his knees, Yuji gave in to the quietude of darkness. He must have nodded off again. His mind was fuzzy, like an effect of his fitful slumber. As he stared vacantly into space, he felt a sting of pain in his abdomen. This was separate from the dull ache plaguing the rest of his body. It was the mysterious symptom flaring up yet again. He grimaced, enduring the rapidly growing pressure. He felt a heat build near his tailbone, and then something crawled from inside him, almost like he'd given birth. He recalled his sister's email, and his mood sank even further. Something hit the floor with a soft, wet plop. The discomfort in his bowels again began to fade, and he heaved a long sigh. The memory of the bathroom floor was burned into his brain. The pool of blood, with a little lump floating in it. This had happened several times since he'd returned home from school. Each time he woke, it happened again. And then there was the sound. The sound like dead leaves being crushed underfoot, coming from inside his room. But that, like this whole disgusting process, was just one more thing he had to accept. He simply didn't have the strength to do anything about it, at least not at the moment. But even if he had, what could he do? His body was no longer under his control. He had no say in when this horror would end. He lay exhausted on the sofa, and his mind began to wander. Not human. That was how Xenia had described him. And maybe he was right. His gaze shifted to the aquarium, and he smiled. His fish were still as beautiful as ever, swimming freely in their rainbow-hued glory. Beautiful, unlike him. He's going to become a fish. Kitani squinted against the headlights from the oncoming lane. With one hand on the wheel, he used the other to crush his cigarette butt in the ashtray. During the week, traffic was fairly light at this time of night, but the weekend was a different story. The windshield wipers swept the rain off the glass. Outside, the wet asphalt glittered like the scales of a fish. His hand moved on autopilot, pulling a cigarette pack from his pocket, but his mind was on something else entirely. Xenia. Yesterday he'd arrived at their rendezvous completely drenched from rain. It had been just past 5. Any later and Kitani would have gone to look for him and his usual hiding spot. Immediately he put his arm around Xenia's shoulder and helped him into the car. The boy had been trembling, both from the cold and from the pain of the bells. Kitani had tried to ask him what happened, but Xenia hadn't answered. Once they reached home, he immediately locked himself in his room. Kitani hadn't seen him this morning either. He tried to call him down to breakfast, but no luck. As worried as he was, there wasn't much he could do. He knew Xenia wouldn't appreciate any attempt to drag him out of his room. At times like these, all he could do was give the young man his space. Frankly, Kitani could use a break. He wasn't tired exactly, just restless. He needed a moment to relax. With that thought, he hopped in the car and drove off. About 15 minutes away from the Okinaga residence, there was a quiet little back street lined with various restaurants. Kitani parked the car in a nearby lot and walked over. At first glance, one might be forgiven for assuming that business was slow. A few restaurants had placed signs on the street, but most seemed uninterested in attracting new customers. Step inside, however, and you would find them buzzing with activity. These restaurants were for people in the know, and each had its own cadre of regulars. As the rain poured from the sky, Kitani hurried down the long alleyway until he arrived at a certain building. The building itself was drab and gray, 5 stories tall, with a different restaurant on each floor. The directory by the entrance was light on information, with little to indicate what each had to offer. The property was owned by Konehito, who had inherited it from his late uncle. Kitani's destination was the bar on the basement floor. He entered the building and headed downstairs and passed through the glass-paneled doors. He was going to go party. As he stepped inside, the host looked up to greet him.
いらっしゃいませ。奥へどうぞ。
Kitani inclined his head in response and then headed towards the back. This was the bar known as the Cerulean Warbler. It was small, with seats for maybe a dozen people. Dim blue light fixtures illuminated the room, shining in wavy patterns across the glossy black floor. Kitani made a beeline to his usual spot at the table farthest from the door. The lighting was poor here, but in exchange it offered a view of the entire bar. His first visit to the Warbler had been back when Konehito's uncle had still been alive. Kitani had been a regular ever since. He always felt at peace here. Somehow it made him nostalgic for those days. It was the perfect place to relax and have a drink. There were 2 other men sitting at the counter. When the bartender came to take his order, Kitani asked for a scotch and then took out a cigarette and set it between his lips. Lighting it deftly, he took a long drag and gazed up at the blue light ceiling as he slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke. Something felt off these days. It wasn't just Xenia either. Konehito had clearly taken a turn for the worse. Now he was even sacrificing animals in his basement chapel. They were going off the rails simultaneously, almost as though they planned it. Was he overthinking things? No. This was wrong. Closing his eyes, Kitani pinched the bridge of his nose, rubbing away the stress. Konehito was, well, the old man was just different now. Kitani would never forget that summer day they'd first met 25 years ago. At the time, Katani had been contemplating suicide. Or murder. He'd managed to graduate from middle school, but hadn't given any thought to his future beyond that. There was no point, he felt. He had no hopes or dreams. He was nothing but a waste of space. Or so his parents had taught him. His father had been an abusive alcoholic. He had a mistress and was hardly ever home. The few times he had come home, he had always been stone drunk and would beat the stuffing out of Katani and his mother, then take his mother's hard-earned savings and leave. Despite this, Katani's mother had always waited faithfully for her husband to return. In Katani's eyes, she had been a pathetic creature. But such a life could not endure forever. Overcome with anger and resentment and loneliness, his mother had suffered a mental breakdown. She started to take it out on her son. "I never should have had you. It's your fault I'm stuck here. I wish you were dead." He lost count of the number of times she said those words. Tragic backstories like his were a dime a dozen, of course, but, as it turns out, the weak all acted in the same predictable ways. Stereotypes existed for a reason, after all. Before he knew it, he was thinking about killing his mother. He would plan it out, down to the minute details, and then trial runs in his head. Ideally, he would kill his father, too. But the fantasy would always change partway through in order to end with Katani's own death. He'd known that he could never go through with it, and yet he couldn't keep the fantasy at bay. Now listen here, YouTube. Don't send me that email. So if anyone knows, if you mention the S word in a video, YouTube will usually strike that video, taking away your monetization on that video, and then send you an email going, "We think you might be suicidal, so we want to help by making it worse." You know, because YouTube is YouTube. His mother rarely fed him, so he didn't bother going to home. Instead, he would roam the streets and pickpocket or shoplift. He started getting into fights, too. Scarcely a day went by without him punching someone. Eventually, the desire to kill his mother shifted into a desire to kill, well, anyone. Day in and day out, he would contemplate murder. But he never acted on his fantasies. He told himself that this was proof of his weakness. Or maybe part of him was still clinging to the hope that his life had some kind of meaning. One night he picked a fight with a group of guys who beat him within an inch of his life. Afterward, he staggered around for a while before collapsing on the street. There, facing the dirt, he thought to himself, maybe he'd be better off dead. If he wanted to take a life so badly, why not take his own? The taste of copper filled his mouth, and the sharp pain flared in his chest. Maybe, if he lay there long enough, he would shrivel up and die. What a relief that would be. The thought brought a smile to his face. He lay there for hours. It was late at night, and hardly any cars passed through that part of town. Eventually, he felt the world begin to fade. At least death was coming. He closed his eyes. The next thing he knew, there was a blinding light. He heard the putter of an exhaust pipe, followed by a door opening and shutting. Footsteps echoed off the asphalt, and he realized that someone was pulled over for him. For a moment, he was disappointed that they hadn't run him over, but this was interrupted by a sharp pain stabbing through his body. Unfortunately, it wasn't the weight of the car. Someone had hauled him into the kneeling position. He opened his eyes to see a man older than his father looking down at him. "Leave me alone. Just let me die." But the words caught in his throat. In the center of the man's wrinkled face shone a pair of cold, cruel eyes. A shiver ran down Kitani's spine.
死にたいのか?
Kitani found himself without an answer. Nevertheless, he worked up the courage to speak.
ほっとけよ。離せ。死にたいのか?
A man repeated his question, then wrapped one hand around Kitani's throat. Thick, powerful fingers dug into his windpipe. Instinctively, he scrabbled at the man's arm, his nails clawed at the man's wrinkled skin. His vision dimmed, then blurred red. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. Was this death?
死にたいのか
The demon's voice echoed in his skull, demanding that he make the ultimate choice. Was this it? He could finally die? But what would death mean? After all his suffering, what had he earned? The satisfaction of death, of achieving the outcome he'd wanted? The thrill of breaking free from the shackles of life? No, the answer was simple. Nothing. He had nothing. Death was just the end. In his mind's eye, he saw himself black and crumbling, like a sheet of paper thrown into the fire. The image filled him with a howl of dread. His words came out as a hoarse whisper. The fingers around his throat held fast. He screamed as loud as he could muster.
死にたくない
That was the last thing he remembered before he lost consciousness. Yakuza for the win? The next time he awoke, he was in the hospital bed. He soon learned that the man who saved his life was Konohito, the boss of the Okinaga Gumi. Finger-shaped bruises lingered on his neck for days afterwards. If you're just gonna get yourself killed anyway, you might as well do it with us, Konohito told him. At first he rebelled, picking fights with other gang members. Konohito himself had to put his lights out more than once. And yet the boss never threatened to cast him out. Eventually he understood this for what it was, proof that the old man cared. Still, it didn't come easy. He struggled to accept the idea that a complete stranger would have any regard for him at all. For a kid who had never known the love of his parents, it was like waking up on another planet. Over time, however, he came to realize that a name was not the only bond that two people could share. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. That was the Okinawa way. Everyone respected Konohito, respected his stoic strength. Once Katani came around, he devoted himself entirely to Konohito. Everything he did was for the boss, not the gang. And so, Katani hadn't thought twice before following Konohito into exile. The lieutenants behind the takeover must have been glad to see him go. They'd never looked kindly on the favor Konohito had shown him. In the end, he had bought his freedom with the tip of his little finger. The small price to pay.
お待たせしました。
The clink of the glass brought Katani out of his reverie. His cigarette had burned half to ash. He crashed it in the ashtray with one hand and then grabbed the glass with the other. Lifting it to his lips, he took a small sip, savoring the taste. What strange beliefs had entrapped his master's mind? Until now, Katani had assumed Konohito had invented his own god to worship. Beyond that, he hadn't given it much thought. But everything he'd witnessed recently, particularly that animal sacrifice, it made him anxious. In the chapel, there was a large chest that held books passed down for generations. He'd seen Konohito rifle through it on occasions. More than likely, those documents were the source of his new faith. Katani knew that he needed to stop Konohito before he did something even worse. And that meant he needed to get inside that chest. Katani swirled the amber liquid in his glass, then took another sip. As the alcohol burned its way down his stomach, he watched the blue lights dance on the walls. He was concerned about Zenya too, and then there was the matter of Yuji and Tetsuo. It wasn't normal for Zenya to fixate on other people, so perhaps there was more to them than it seemed. He would have to keep an eye on them. At this point, he realized that this little excursion wasn't shaping up to be much of a break at all. Shaking his head to himself, Katani set the glass down and pulled out another cigarette. And that's where we're gonna leave it. So thank you guys for joining me for today's episode. I hope you guys are enjoying this series as much as I am. And I will see you guys next time. Have a fantastic day, everybody. Bye, guys.